This is the original Crysis 3 with 8x MSAA enabled, and this highly specular aliased scene is used to dogpile MSAA for not minimizing shimmering, unlike blurry temporal methods used today. To defend MSAA, this channel explained how Half-Life Alyx and other devs combat specular aliasing independently of blurry or expensive temporal methods using modern shaders and filtered bitmaps. This is a more intensive scene rendered on a desktop 3060 at 1080p, and it takes about 55% of the GPU to produce 60 FPS on the maximum settings with no anti-aliasing. A couple of commands are used to stabilize performance as well as provide a cleaner image. Now, many people like to take this scene and enable 8x MSAA to portray MSAA as this horrifically power-hungry option. Anyone without context is going to believe this because we can see that it basically doubled the scene processing requirements. The disdain for MSAA gets even worse when it seems like nothing in the scene is even being anti-aliased. This is nothing like the profound results seen in Half-Life Alyx, where every edge is perfectly resolved. And Half-Life Alyx just uses 4x MSAA, a setting that is still extremely unperformant in Crysis 3. Now, anyone can compare the technical differences between these games, but many people are going to blame the mere combination of MSAA and deferred rendering for MSAA's much worse performance in Crysis 3. But one of the main conclusions mentioned in our Half-Life Alyx analysis was if the cost of MSAA is high, it's due to other pre-existing optimization issues in the rendering pipeline. And boy, does this describe Crysis 3. So in this video, you're going to be shown 3 major ways in which Crysis 3's pipeline and unsuspecting users blow MSAA's performance, and 3 ways explaining why MSAA looks so poor in Crysis 3. This will provide a foundation for certain important conclusions, explain the viability of MSAA in modern deferred renderers, and hopefully prevent similar butchered pipelines from ever representing MSAA performance like these have for the past 13 years. The first issue is the pre-pass logic, and we'll compare the scene with 2x MSAA and no anti-aliasing. A depth pre-pass is a common rendering stage where on-screen objects have their depth rendered on a buffer so the GPU automatically prevents expensive material shading behind these pixels. An optimized deferred pre-pass would have only drawn large, non-alpha tested objects like this. A good partial pre-pass is one of deferred rendering's best advantages over forward plus rendering, which typically requires an expensive full pre-pass. As long as the geometry quad overdraw is optimized, the depth rendering with or without MSAA will remain identical in rendering speed. The problem with Crysis 3's actual pre-pass is that it doesn't render large objects in the distance, and it renders expensive and extremely dense alpha-tested content, which is something that Half-Life Alyx's pipeline specifically doesn't do. These foliage draws use multiple 4K by 2K texture atlases that should have at least used BC4 compression to prevent unnecessary performance-wasting RGB processing. It is because of these foliage draws that should have never been there in the first place that the cost of the pre-pass is doubled with multi-sampling anti-aliasing. With 2x MSAA, around 0.3 milliseconds could have been saved. That cost is almost equivalent to the rendering of the base pass with 2x MSAA. The base pass re-renders everything in the pre-pass with all the other scene meshes with material textures that write the required lighting stage arithmetic variables in organized buffer layouts. The gbuffer layout designed for Crysis 3 creates major visual issues that ruin MSAA. To accommodate for bandwidth limitations found on 7th gen console hardware like the Xbox 360, values like geometry normals, which typically range from 24 to 30 bits, are only stored with 17 bits. But the biggest issue is that base color information that is almost always 24 bits is stored only using 16 bits, using a compression described in this paper. Now, the results are actually quite remarkable, as the only major difference is in edges, but that's where MSAA occurs. This is why many edges in Crysis suffer from these green and purple tints. The purpose of MSAA is to make higher frequency shading more easily perceptible, but even with 8x MSAA, it won't anti-alias the scene. It will anti-alias corrupted texels. This is a major issue your eyes will notice. This is without a doubt related to the compressed albedo buffer, as similarly to Fox Engine, a light pre-pass is used for deferred shading, meaning direct lighting is done without the albedo buffer. It is only until the albedo buffer is used during the lighting resolve stage where these corrupted edges appear. This small open source engine from the early 2010s provides a small visual sneak peek of what deferred MSAA will look like with somewhat modern normals and standard 24-bit albedo base colors, while all other G-buffer information is stored in the alpha channels. This looks way better than anything in Crysis 3, but even this deferred renderer shares MSAA visual impairments found in CryEngine 3 and many other deferred MSAA implementations like early Rockstar engine titles. This being faulty subsample shading. But first we need to explain the pipeline a bit. G-buffer sizes are multiplied by the number of MSAA samples. You can visualize how MSAA buffers store pixel data at a sample frequency with this 2D graph. As explained in other videos, such massive amounts of memory could create major slowdowns in complex passes performed on 7th gen hardware. So, this somewhat expensive draw appears after the base pass whenever MSAA is enabled and copies the sample 0 data into separate non-MSAA render targets. This is where a custom MSAA edge stencil is created. Every 4x4 pixels, or quads, with MSAA subsamples are tagged in white, and this is shaded into the depth stencil buffer at pixel frequency, as indicated by the invocations. Now, pixel and sample frequency shading can be easily separated by the hardware. First, pixel frequency draws use the non-multi-sampled render targets to evaluate non-multi-sampled quads. The invocations and rendered pixels aren't synchronized like they usually are, because when a pixel frequency shader is writing to a multi-sampled render target, it's only going to invoke pixel shaders at a pixel frequency, but pixel frequency invocations will automatically render pixels at the sample frequency. Now, it turns out after a couple of tests that modern hardware has been designed to do this without impacting performance too much, unless 8x MSAA is in use. Pixel frequency draws are immediately followed by sample frequency draws that create dedicated pixel shader invocations for each sample, while swapping out the pixel frequency inputs for the original multi-sampled render targets. A major issue arises from the stencil mask, as it's the reason why jagged edges persist even with 8x MSAA. These faulty issues also contribute to poor specular stability. Despite aiming for correct MSAA results, the logic used to create the stencil mask misses tons of important edges. The correct geometric information has always resided in the G-buffers, but the faulty stencil prevents the necessary passes from accessing them. A proper resolve makes a huge difference even at 4x MSAA. This particular comparison is important in showing how a proper resolve would minimize some specular instabilities. But it gets worse. Take this rain scene that Digital Foundry loves to use to showcase MSAA. That same scene where their member had to assure everyone that MSAA was actually enabled. Well, this scene has a bug where the stencil gets completely messed up, causing the entire lighting pass to reject on sample frequency passes. This happens over and over for every light. It is only hundreds of draws later where the stencil is restored to its intended form, just before the main deferred lighting buffer resolve, which also blends a single directional light with multisampling. The gun receives a little bit more multisampling as it has a metallic cube map forward rendered on top of it, though the multisampling is still limited by that faulty stencil. Influencers often show people performance comparisons with the highest and unoptimized settings. Changing a single setting will massively help MSAA because when shading quality is set above medium, deferred lights shade 2 times slower than typical modern deferred renderers that provide superior visuals. Medium shading disables a number of effects like AO, which are used in the lighting pass, but using compensatory commands, it turns out AO has no effect on the shading efficiency. While 4x and 2x MSAA receive performance gains, it's questionable to say if the gains are relevant considering more complex BRDFs are needed in modern shading. Remember that MSAA has been around for years, and it was created during a time where display resolutions could not provide sufficient sampling density. Without enough sampling density, objects will not appear coherent enough, and this can appear temporally unstable. Lackluster sampling density artifacts are pretty easy to understand if you inspect 720 and 1080p hair rendering in, say, Fox Engine. We need to strictly focus on rendering density, and the first thing to notice is that the target density in resolution format is not sustainable at 60 FPS on modern affordable hardware. The only reason why we care about resolution is because we want the results to scale properly with our modern displays like 1080p, which is luckily integer scalable with 4K. Since 1080p is already 50% ahead in sampling density than 720p, we only need half the multisampling. 8 times MSAA at 1080p is extremely overkill if you're targeting reasonable rendering densities. Take a look at this comparison, and ignore jagged lines and focus more on the overall temporal stability of the scene. After 4 times MSAA at 1080p, we face diminishing returns outside of jagged lines, which cheap morphological solutions combined with 4 times MSAA have already surpassed. As for 1440p, because it provides 50% more density than 1080p, we need to half the multisampling again, which brings us down to 2 times MSAA. Because typical modern games aim for much more complex graphics than when MSAA was invented, we do need to find extra performance headroom to help us compensate for the trend-breaking increases in pixel count, in which 1440p relieved years after 4K was introduced to the market. This is why a stable 60 FPS is so important outside of basic playability standards, because 60 FPS is going to allow us to get 2 free geometric samples using persistence. While the left side resolve needs to be tested, ATI before they were purchased by AMD provided persistence-based MSAA. The problem back then was the fact that display resolutions were too low to hide persistence flicker, and it was vendor locked. Now modern GPUs and graphic APIs allow us to do this on all vendors. MFAA is Nvidia's version of this concept, and this generally looks great with no noticeable texture blurring or ghosting. That is, until low luminance scenes break the vendor exclusive feature. A vendor agnostic method will be able to utilize animated motion vectors and should be able to eliminate this kind of ghosting with modern rejection methods. What is essentially being suggested for 1080p and integer scaled 4K gaming is a mix of both of these presentations linked in the description. Basically a modernized version of SMAA 4X, which is by far the most optimized anti-aliasing method in the game, as it performs well and looks pretty good considering we've had major advancements in frame rate projection, motion vectors are not generated for foliage or particles, the MSA is not working properly as explained earlier, there's no jittered bitmaps, and the sample positions are extremely primitive. Yet part of the reason why this looks so reasonable is because the standalone temporal options are much more competent than modern solutions. Look at how much more detail you can see with SMAA 2TX 13 years ago. In this slow forward motion comparison, we can see how minimal its temporal addition is. Whereas more recent titles within the decade, like Crysis 2 Remastered, the SMAA 2TX is abominable and bears no resemblance to the original design. This kind of regression has been happening to game after game since then. The left-hand side shown here is what the majority of games are shipping with now, whereas the right-hand side shows how powerful geometric sampling can be even for neglected shader AA content. Only a fraction of that right-hand sampling method will already reach the cost of 8 times MSAA when all we need is 2 times MSAA. Moving on to the next reason why MSAA will never look right in Crysis 3. We're going to use this edge as an example. You should never see this kind of temporal shimmering with proper MSAA, but even if we bypass the stencil with full subsample shading, the edge is still very aliased. This is particularly poor because as long as you're not in that beginning rain level, processing power was wasted computing subsample lighting. The problem comes from the AO, which is not computed with subsampling nor use multisampled render targets as input. After direct lighting is computed, the pipeline composites the AO inside the diffuse render target using a pixel frequency draw, and this step destroys the subsample lighting. The specular buffer is untouched, so when the albedo specular resolve comes around, we end up with extremely uncanny edges. If the ambient occlusion composite step is removed before the albedo specular resolve, the edges will then look reasonable outside of color compression artifacts. Even without forced full subsample lighting, these particular edges are temporally stable because the custom edge detection stencil does recognize these edges properly. We don't need to remove SSAO, as this has been taken care of by modern graphic engineering. Since this video is exceeding a sustainable time limit for us, here's 3 major things the industry needs to start discussing. We have barely tapped the surface of optimizing the visual output of MSAA. For instance, most games will suffer from these dark highlights in between MSAA edges, which can be fixed with linear blending. You can check this out with a configurable demo link in the description. There's also growing research in resolving these MSAA steps differently. Personally, I think there might be potential in altering a hybrid resolve that ties in depth to possibly emulate diffraction elements found in healthy eyes, something that flat displays can't convey like a window can. After reading this comment and performing a few rendering experiments, it became clear that deferred rendering with sample frequency shading is somehow hindering quad utilization. Based on this comment, it might be better to output the HDR lighting in two separate non-MSAA RGB A16 outputs using pixel frequency shading, with each holding sample 0 and sample 1 data. Today, the latest CryEngine offers no MSAA and continues their Crysis 3 tradition of broken anti-aliasing. Not even their default morphological anti-aliasing can smooth edges at this point. If you would like to keep the production of these videos sustainable, consider joining our Patreon. Until then, watch our videos in order of release, and thank you for watching this one.